Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Poking Around Phoenixville. I'm Lou Beccaria and thanks for taking the time to be with us. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. As you know, on these Poking Around Phoenixville shows, we always try to bring you interesting things that are happening around town, interesting people, people with interesting backgrounds. And today, of course, we have just that. We have our guest, Peter Eustis, who is a Phoenixvillian, who has a very interesting background as a Marine pilot with a very special unit in the Marines called the Presidential Detail. And he had the honor and privilege of escorting around several presidents of the United States during his tour with the Presidential Detail. So, Peter, welcome to the show. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here, Lou. Thank you.
Well, for the benefit of our guests, of our viewers, could you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I'm originally from Reading, Pennsylvania. I went to Reading High School. After graduating from high school, I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I was in Navy ROTC, and through Navy ROTC, I decided to take what used to be called in those days the Marine option. Uh-huh. So I became a Marine officer. I went to what was called basic school, which is the infantry school, for 6 months. And while I was there, a recruiting group came by and said, you ought to think about naval aviation. So I decided to take the physical. I passed it, went to flight school down in Pensacola. Actually started off in fixed wing. Flew, the first airplane I flew was the T-34. And then after that, the T-28. Did gunnery, carrier quals, flew a twin engine plane to get my instrument rating. And then you had a choice, either jets or helicopters. Vietnam was just starting, so I was selected for helicopters and went into, finished my helicopter training, went to North Carolina, went to Europe, went to Vietnam, came back. From Vietnam, joined the Presidential Helicopter Squadron, which is called HMX-1. After that, I spent 8 years in the Marines, got out, started working for Dun & Bradstreet, traveled or got transferred all over the country with them, and retired from them, and then worked for a trade association in New York City, lived there for a while, for about 10 years, retired and came back to this area.
Wow, that's quite a productive career. Well, going back to the military part of it, since that's what relates to the topic of the show, what drew you to the Marines and also to flying in particular?
Well, you know, growing up, I never thought about being a pilot. When I was being trained in NROTC one summer, I did fly in jets, and I kind of liked it a little bit, but never really thought that much about it. To be really honest, I think I joined the Marines originally because I wasn't that crazy about being on ships. Oh. And I went to fly because you made, in those days, a second lieutenant got $222 a month. Uh-huh. You got an extra $100 if you flew. That seemed pretty attractive. I had just gotten married. I thought an extra $100 would be a good idea. So that's how I got into flying.
Okay, well, money talks, I guess.
To some degree, yes.
So tell us about the training that you went through to be a helicopter pilot.
Well, especially in those days, there was no distinction between being a helicopter pilot and being a fixed-wing pilot. So I really got naval aviator training. I started off in fixed wings, went through everything, including instrument training, gunnery, as I mentioned before, carrier. I landed on the USS Lexington for my carrier quals. Did fixed wing, did radio instruments, and then started off in a small helicopter called the H-13, and then the H-34. And then I got my wings. Then I was assigned to a squadron in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And that squadron went down to the Caribbean, went to Europe. Then after coming back from there, got sent to Vietnam, spent a tour over there. And then when I came back from Vietnam, I got assigned to HMX-1, the Presidential Helicopter Squadron.
So the Presidential Detail, or the Helicopter Squadron, is not something that you volunteer for, you get chosen for it?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Or you guess, I guess you get chosen because when we were in the squadron, we used to always wonder, well, why they choose us versus somebody else? I think I was a pretty good pilot, and I had a pretty good record, and perhaps just because they needed pilots at a certain point in time when a couple of us were coming back from Vietnam, we were assigned to that squadron. Now, HMX-1 is just not the presidential helicopter squadron. In fact, I have brought a DVD along that perhaps we can show at some point in the program. But the squadron was started right after World War II as a helicopter testing squadron, and it's still, at least up until when I was there, we actually did a lot of testing of helicopters. Okay. While there, I flew the H-1, which is the Huey. I flew the H-3, which is the helicopter that is the presidential helicopter. Flew the H-53, the H-46, and we did all kinds of testing. We did other kinds of duties besides just the president, but supporting the president took up most of the time.
How large is the squadron?
The squadron's about 30, at least in those days, was about 30, 35 pilots. There were 10 helicopters that were presidential helicopters. Okay. And there were about another 20 or 30 aircraft that were other kinds of aircraft, which we did other things, including supporting the president. Back in those days, for instance, I remember flying Hueys a lot around D.C. with Secret Service agents, doing monitoring and checking, especially during the inauguration. Yeah.
My guest is Peter Eustis, Phoenixvillian here, who is a former presidential detail helicopter pilot, and we're talking about his fine experiences with the military in that role. Going back to the helicopters, tell us about the presidential helicopters. Are they specially outfitted in some way, or how big are they? How many passengers can they hold?
Believe it or not, the helicopters that President Obama is flying in today are the same helicopters I flew 40 years ago.
Same type, or the actual same helicopter?
Well, for sure it's the same type, and I think to a large degree it's the same helicopter. Wow. Now, they've been upgraded a lot, and they are the best maintained helicopters in the world.
I can imagine.
They are pretty much taken apart and put back together again. Quite often. I'm sure the latest avionics and the maintenance is supported not only by marine mechanics, but by Sikorsky factory people.
Now, I know you were in the military, and of course, I guess there's a certain amount of security clearance just to being in the military. Did you have to have a special security clearance in order to be in the presidential detail squadron?
There was, as I recall, a special White House clearance that you had to have before you could do it. The duty was not only just flying the president around every once in a while. In those days, one of the things that everybody worried about was nuclear attack. So we always had 3 helicopters on standby, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to evacuate the president and other people in case of a nuclear attack. We were constantly drilled when we did that. We would be 3 days on duty doing that, and then 3 days off. And that was actually one of the biggest parts of our duty. Yeah. And we would be drilled in the middle of the night. They'd ring the bell, and we'd have to be in front of the White House, flying by, landing within a couple of minutes. And we always did it.
That's a lot of pressure, and you obviously no time for yourself. Now, tell us typically where you flew when you were flying the presidential helicopters. Only in the United States, or did you go over to overseas?
We'd send details to I remember Uruguay and to Italy, and always when Johnson, because I supported both Johnson and Nixon, with Johnson down to the ranch in Texas, with Nixon down to Key Biscayne, because he'd like to go down there. And he had a friend, I can't remember his name right now, but who had owned an island. It was called K. Walker. I somehow remember that. And we'd fly him out to that island, President Nixon, to relax. So we would support him if he traveled, and if it were possible to take the helicopters. And when they went to vacation, normally Johnson always went to his ranch, and Nixon used to like to go down to Key Biscayne.
Yeah. On the presidential helicopter, how many people could the helicopters seat comfortably?
The accommodations are such that it seats fewer people than it could really seat. Okay. The president and a couple other people have very luxurious kind of seats. The helicopter would have a crew in those days of 4, a pilot, a co-pilot, and 2 crew members who acted as the crew chief, and they would always be dressed in the uniforms that you see today. Besides that, generally speaking, as I recall, there was always at least 1 or 2 Secret Service agents who'd be aboard, the president and his wife, and maybe 2 or 3 other people.
Any medical people, just in case something
in those days,
extraordinary happened?
I don't remember having medical people. I bet you they do today, but back then, interesting, because I sort of reflect on how I think it's different now. I think it was a little looser than it is now. Because we didn't worry about missile attacks or against the air
the times
missiles.
are different. Yeah.
And so, there weren't those kind of things. So a lot of times we would fly just, let's say we were picking up the president at Andrews Air Force Base and taking them back to the White House. We'd have maybe 2 birds doing the whole thing. And I'm sure they have many more than that doing it now.
Tell us a little bit about the 2 presidents that you actually escorted around. I call it escorting. President Johnson and President Nixon. Tell us a little bit about the kind of people they were and some of the things that, places that you took them to.
You never get to really meet him that well, but my recollection is that Johnson was a little sterner, I guess. He was a little bit more demanding than President Nixon was. Now that sort of seems odd because I think the images sort of would be different.
Yeah.
But President Nixon always came up and thanked the pilots.
Really?
Yes, for the flight, and he was always very gracious. And the one thing I do remember was that this this duty was kind of harder than wise because I had just gotten back from Vietnam. Well, as soon as I got back, I got this center training to fly this new helicopter. I went down to Florida. Then we had this evacuation duty, which meant that really half the time, for sure, you're away from home. So we were separated a lot. Well, President Nixon invited my wife up to the White House for a reception, and I always remember that President Johnson did not, but maybe it wasn't at the right time or something. But I sort of remember President Nixon as being much friendlier than President Johnson.
Wow. Any interesting or unusual, maybe even funny things happen in the course of doing this kind of detail?
A couple things that I do recall. One is we also flew a lot of other dignitaries. The vice president quite often, the secretaries of the different branches. Remember flying Vice President Agnew and his wife Judy back from Andrews to the Naval Observatory, where that's where the vice president's residence is. And it was a kind of rough and choppy day. And I do remember that Judy Agnew got airsick. And, that was one thing we tried to avoid, but there was just no way I could. It was just too bumpy. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I have another story, which is that.
Well, we need to take a break now for commercial, but I do want to come back to that because I'm sure that these are good stories. My guest is Peter Eustis, and we're talking about his career as a helicopter pilot in the Presidential Detail Squadron of the United States. And we'll be right back with more. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome back to Poking Around Phoenixville. I'm Lou Beccaria, and thanks for staying with us. For those of you who are just tuning in, we have the pleasure today of talking with Peter Eustis, a local Phoenixvillian who had the interesting experience and background and opportunity to be a presidential pilot with the Presidential Detail Squadron during the years 1966 to 1969. So continuing on, Peter, when we broke for commercial, you were talking about some of the interesting or unusual and maybe even funny stories of things that happened during the course of your 2.5 or 3 years as a helicopter pilot for the presidents. Any more?
Well, I did tell you about Judy Agnew. Well, I also have a story about President Agnew. And
Vice President Agnew.
I'm sorry, Vice President Agnew. And as you recall, Vice President Agnew was of Greek descent.
Yes.
And so am I. My parents were Greek Americans. And so when I actually used to fly Vice President Agnew quite often, and every time he would come up and shake your hand and say thanks for the flight. So I thought, I wonder if he knows that I share the same background he does. I really should kind of let him know, but how am I going to do that? So one time when he came up to shake my hand, he said, thank you, and I answered him in Greek, Parakalo, which means you're welcome. And he looked at me, he held my hand, he had, I don't know if you recall those kind of beady eyes he had, and he kind of looked, and he just dropped my hand and exited the helicopter. He never came up again when I was flying him to thank me. So
really?
I thought that was kind of interesting.
That was very interesting.
Yeah.
You think it would just have the opposite effect.
I was kind of hoping for the opposite effect, but it didn't work.
Yeah. Now, aside from things like that, anything of a dangerous nature happen in the course of flying? Unusual things where you had to make quick decisions?
Not in when we were flying dignitaries, because we were highly prepared. We wouldn't do anything that even was remotely dangerous. We were very careful in how we maneuvered the helicopter. We knew exactly where we were going and what we were going to do. So, no, nobody ever, I can say, was even close.
No close calls.
No close calls at all. Now, I sort of see it as a humorous story, is that when President Nixon was being inaugurated, I don't know, that was 1968's,
January 69.
January 69. That was a very tumultuous period in American history. You remember the Democratic Convention. So the Secret Service was really worried about people disrupting the inauguration. So we flew a lot of missions. I used to, flying around DC, especially during that time, looking for people on rooftops. And this was unusual. Now I'm sure they do this all the time, but back then that was kind of an unusual activity. And I used to take up a couple of Secret Service guys by myself, actually, without even a co-pilot. I'd have a DC policeman in the left seat. I'd have 2 or 3 Secret Service people with gyroscopic equipment so they can look in the ground with binoculars and then to have the shaking of the helicopter affect them. And of course they had sniper rifles just in case something came up. And when I used to fly them, they'd say, I want to see something, and I'd really bank the helicopter and so they could look straight down. Well, they hated that. So every time they came back and they said, gee, I wish you didn't have, I said, well, that's the only way you're going to be able to see. And so I remember when it was time to, who wants to go up? And we'd ask around, and everybody would kind of look at you, isn't it your turn to go? So
we want to fly with these two. Now, did the presidents mind that when you were banking? Or
well, no, we'd be very careful and very smooth and deliberate when